When we talk about salvation, what do we mean? Join me as we gain a new perspective on salvation. Today, in our third installment of A New Perspective on Salvation, we want to look at part 2 of A New Perspective on the Fall. This is not so much the fall of man. That took place in Genesis chapter 3. But Jews of the first century, right around the time of Christ, they saw 3 falls taking place in Genesis. The first, of course, is the fall of man. The second is the fall of heaven in Genesis chapter 6. When the people began to multiply in the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives. There are 2 main interpretations of this. The Jewish interpretation of the first century just took the words for what they said. They believed that the sons of God represent some form of celestial being, call them angels. In the early literature, they're called watchers. But they fell. They saw women and they desired them. It's interesting that what it says about the woman is that they saw them. New Living Translation says saw the beautiful women. The actual literal translation is that the sons of God saw the daughters of men were good. Just like Adam and Eve saw the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and saw that it was good and pleasing. Well, the word for pleasing doesn't occur here, but the word for good certainly does. New Living Translation here translates that as good. Now, that is one possible interpretation. The other main interpretation, which it's been around since the early church fathers. It's called the Sethite interpretation. In the Sethite interpretation, the sons of God are the descendants of Seth, who are true followers of Jehovah. And they are attracted to the daughters of men, the daughters of Cain. And they intermarry with them, and that starts all form of evil. Here's the problem with that interpretation. The phrase, sons of God, only occurs about 6 times in the Old Testament. Every time it occurs, it refers to celestial beings. We see it in Job 1:6 and 2:1. There it says that God held court in heaven. We're going to come back to that in just a second. One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Members of the heavenly court, the sons of God. Same thing occurs in 2 verse 1. Members of the heavenly court is New Living Translation. It literally says the sons of God came before the Lord. We also find this in Job 38:7. We see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. When the Most High assigned lands to the nations, he divided up the human race. He established the boundaries of his peoples according to the number in his heavenly court. Literally, according to the number of the sons of God. Now, even that is, that's caused some consternation. Some of the early texts change that to the children of Israel, the sons of Israel. But the oldest text, including Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls, says sons of God. The Septuagint, which translates a very, very old Hebrew text into Greek, says angels, sons of God. According to Jewish theology around the time of Christ and preceding this, they believe that there was a certain segment of heaven that fell. Some of the early texts actually put a number on it. I read through this passage in the book of 1st Enoch. It says 200 of them fell. It names 17 of them, 17 of the main leaders. It says that they came and they lusted after and took the daughters of men. In Genesis chapter 6, it goes on and it says that they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times. Some of the translations, the word actually used here is translated in other places as giants. The offspring of the heavenly beings and the daughters of men became giants. They were unusual. They stood out. Heroes, great warriors, giants. This is one of the few places that it's mentioned in the Old Testament. But the mention is so consistent that around the time of Christ, they developed an entire theology about this. In fact, they said that the fall actually took place on Mount Hermon near Idre. Now, in Joshua chapter 12, it says, these are the kings, verse 1, these are the kings east of the Jordan River who'd been killed by the Israelites, whose land was taken. Their territory extended from the Arnon Gorge to Mount Hermon, included all the land east of the Jordan Valley. King Sihon of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, was defeated. His kingdom included Aroer on the edge of the Arnon Gorge, extended from the middle of the Arnon Gorge to the Jabbok River. It serves as a boundary to the Ammonites. We drop down to verse 4. King Og of Bashan, the last of the Rephaites, the last of the giants, lived at Ashtaroth and Edrei. He ruled a territory stretching from Mount Hermon to Salekah in the north, to all of Bashan in the east, westward to the borders of the kingdoms of Jeshur and Makkah. The reference to the defeat of King Sihon and King Og occurs here in Joshua 12. It occurs also in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, and in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. In all of these passages, there's a reference to them as being giants, all centered around Mount Hermon. Near the end of our time together, not today, but in a few weeks, we'll come back to this point. The bottom line is this. It appears in the Old Testament that there is such a thing as a divine council. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, the passage that we read earlier, there is a reference to God portioning out the nations of the world to this divine council. It appears that in Jewish theology, they believed that the nations were handed to these celestial beings so that the celestial beings could bring them to a knowledge of God. But instead of doing that, they fell. They lusted after earthly women, and they sinned with those earthly women. The exception to this is Israel. The passage, Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, says, the people of Israel belong to the Lord. Jacob is his special possession. Michael Heiser is recently deceased, but he developed this concept. Now, it's been around for a very long time. He renovated it. He did a lot more research, and he found quite a body of reference to the idea of a divine council. God gives the nations to underlings, and he asks them, lead them to follow me. They don't. In each and every case, they lead them to follow themselves. And as a result, all of the nations of the world have a God. It's a different God in each case. Did you ever wonder why that was? Could it be because those celestial beings fell? The Jews of the first century certainly thought so. Could it be that the stories in mythology of gods coming down to have intercourse with women and great heroes being born from them, heroes like Hercules in Greek mythology, Perseus in Greek mythology, son of a male god and a woman here on earth? Could it be that as time grew, fathers passed on to a son the story of what had happened, and it grew outside of Israel into the mythology that we have today, whereas the true account is kept for us in Genesis chapter 6. No matter what you believe about Genesis 6 and the fall of the celestial beings, one thing is certainly true. This fall is a fall due to pleasure. Whether it's the descendants of Seth or whether it's celestial beings, this fall relates to pleasure. Do you remember the three types of temptation that there are? There is the temptation to possess. The fall of man was a temptation to possess. To possess in Genesis 3, a new knowledge to become like God. The fall in Genesis 6 is a fall due to pleasure. They saw the daughters of men and saw that they were good, and so they took them. A fall due to possession, a fall due to passion. A second fall that's recorded in the book of Genesis. We come back to this when we look at the solution that God gives, because he resolves even this fall.